In 1846, the Mormon Battalion was tasked with finding a southern wagon route to California. Its record-setting 2,000-mile march passed through Yuma, Arizona. It was made up of over 500 volunteers at the beginning of the military campaign, and as they left Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and reached the Gila River, that number had been reduced to 335 soldiers. The Mormon Battalion was a division of General Stephen Kearny's U.S. Army of the West. They served during the Mexican War from July 1846 through July 1847, and they made history for making the longest march, going from the Council Bluffs of Iowa through Yuma, Arizona, and then on into San Diego, California, as well as being the only religious unit in the history of U.S. military service. Very early in the morning on Thursday, January 7, 1847, Colonel St. George Cook sent Pauline Weaver, a military scout, to examine thoroughly the difficult spot where the volcanic mountains come into the river known as Devil's Point. Today, that would be the bridge over the Gila River on Highway 95. A road was cut through a dense stand of willow, cottonwood, and undergrowth around the mountain to its last point, at which they camped. Here, Colonel Cook was forced to abandon a wagon that had been broken during that day's 7-mile march. Friday, January 8, 1847, the battalion continued on and marched a total of 16 miles on good road. That evening, they camped in a vast bottom on the south bank of the Gila River, about a mile from its mouth today. Today, this area is marked with commercial and agricultural development just west of the Gila-Colorado nexus. A march of 10 miles over a bottom which in some places was heavy sand and in others miry clay brought us to the crossing of the Colorado. Here, 40 men were detailed to gather the mesquite seeds or tornia to feed the famishing mules upon. The river was found to be quite as wide, though not so deep as the Missouri, and the water much the same color as that river. Daniel Tyler, January 9, 1847. The Colorado River was once a water highway and major crossing point at the Narrows, which was the easiest place to cross the river into California. With the starving and weakened condition of the battalion members, the crossing was particularly challenging. The animals were broken and struggling as well. All dreaded the miles of barren desert ahead of them. About 15 bushels of mesquite beans were brought in, and the men used them in various ways. Some ground the beans in coffee mills and mixed them with flour, others made pudding, and some roasted them or ate them raw. When they reached the Colorado River, Colonel Cook sent a guide over to fire the thickets so the command could cross. The following morning, the flotilla 2 wagon boxes used as rafts arrived, and some of the pack mules arrived with 420 pounds of flour that had been left on the bank of the Gila River. Immediately after the pontoon boats arrived on the Gila River, the companies were ordered to ferry across the Colorado River, leaving only their empty wagons, mule teamsters, and cattle details. Only 10 head of cattle remained at this point of the trail, and were in very poor condition. 130 of the sheep were to be taken over in pontoon boats at 5 o'clock the following morning. The empty wagons were drawn over by the mule teams early the same morning, and each mule was ridden as the crossing was made. 3 of the mules gave out due to exhaustion and drowned, complicating the crossing. Ferrying across the river commenced on January 10, 1847 and continued through the night until late the next morning. The operation started down the river and was half a mile across, requiring about an hour and a half to traverse both ways. The men pushed the makeshift wagon boats through the 4-foot deep water with poles 10 feet long. The water was cold and swift in the channels, with an inch of ice in the calm spots. The swift ford where the wagons crossed was about 4 feet deep and over a mile wide, and complicated by several channels that were hundreds of yards across.
I passed the river on the 10th and 11th of January. On the first day and night, the loading of the wagons and many men were boated over. On the morning of the 11th, the mules were driven 2 miles from grass, then drew the wagons through the long ford of a mile, nearly swimming. The wagons were then loaded in the willow thicket, and I marched 15 miles over the sandy road to the first well, the same day, and a great effort and labor. Colonel St. George Cook.
Today, this monument to the battalion stands where that story unfolded at Yuma in West Wetlands Park on the narrowing banks of the Colorado River. The U.S. Army of the West Mormon Battalion Foundation erected a bronze statue in 2007. to commemorate the historic journey of 2,000 miles marched by the dedicated saints of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.